Hello and welcome to episode 11, Pre-War Dreams. My name is Joe, and we're going to do part two, kind of, from my last video, which was a book that I read about Ty Cobb. I just finished another book, Glory of Their Times, a book that was, I can't even tell you how many times I heard about it on different videos from a lot of the community. So I thought that I would read it as well. It's an awesome book. Um, all of the players that were involved with it had great stories. And what I kind of am just going to do tonight is just highlight four of them. And the four that I'm going to highlight are players that I'm looking to acquire a card of. So the first player highlighted would be Rube Marquard. Um, his dad was an educator, very similar to Ty Cobb's dad from the last book that I read. He was a bat boy for the Cleveland Naps, and at 16, because he was such a good pitcher, he had a relationship with actually the Naps third baseman. He actually took a 5-day trip to Waterloo, Iowa. He basically hitchhiked on a train and went from Cleveland to Waterloo, Iowa. They offered him $100 a month to pitch, um, and he, after pitching in Waterloo, Cleveland offered to do $100 a month, and he actually turned it down. He thought he was worth more, and he ended up signing with Indianapolis, one of the affiliate teams, for $200 a month in the minors. His first game in 1907, he pitched a 4-hit shutout versus actually Cleveland. And the owner of Cleveland offered $3,500 to buy Rube, but Rube told the Indianapolis owner no, he wouldn't go. Opening day in 1908, still pitching for Indy, he beat Kansas City 2-1. And what's fascinating about that is the losing pitcher for Kansas City was a gentleman by the name of Smokey Joe Wood, another Hall of Famer. He pitched a no-hitter that year, and that year he completed 47 games and had 28 wins. And at the end of the 1908 season, he was sold to the New York Giants for $11,000. One of the huge things I kept reading throughout the entire Rue Marquard segment was that he loved his life. He loved baseball, and he thought that the number one person that influenced him the most in baseball and was his favorite person in baseball was his manager, John McGraw. Um, he said that he never smoked or drank in his entire life. While he was with the New York Giants, his roommate was Christy Mathewson. Um, Very similar to Cobb, from 1912 to 1914, he performed vaudeville in the winters to make extra money. And he wanted to go to the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1915. And so he approached the New York Giants, Wilbert Robinson, from the Dodgers, and the Giants told him that if he wanted to go there so bad, he had to work himself a deal. So he actually called Wilbert Robertson, who thought it was a joke when he called, and he traded himself from the New York Giants to the Dodgers in 1915 for $7,500. And in 1916, he was pitching a game, and afterwards in the locker room, they said that there was a gentleman there to see him. And when Rube went out of the locker room, he realized that it was his father. His father and him did not talk hardly at all for about 10 years. And his dad finally came to see him play. And Rube in the book talked about how they spent about a week and a half or 2 weeks together, and it was one of the fondest memories of his entire life. Just a very interesting man. And the story and his version of the story that was told in this book, I thought was very, very well done. The next player I want to talk about is Smokey Joe Wood, who I'd mentioned a couple minutes ago. In 1912, he went 34-5. Many viewed him as the second fastest pitcher in the majors. Boston won a World Series that year in 1912, although Walter Johnson in 1912 disagreed and said that Joe was the fastest pitcher in baseball. He grew up in Ouray, Colorado, which is in the southwest corner of Colorado. It was the old Wild West when he lived there, and his family moved to Ness, Kansas when he was a child. His dad was a lawyer, but his dad was lived a very full life. Joe mentioned that he was a brilliant man, but he was an adventurer. For instance, he left his practice during the gold rush and went out west to try to strike gold. He started playing baseball at the age of 16 in Ness City, 1906. He started his career with the Bloomer Girls, which is a pro team that had women on it, but they also dressed men up as women to play. And same as Rogers Hornsby, who started with them as well. He was offered $20 in 3 weeks to play. By 1907, at age 17, he played in Hutchinson, Kansas. And by 1908, while in Kansas City, again for the minor league team, he was bought by the Boston Red Sox. Again, as I mentioned, in 1912, when they won the World Series, he actually battled Rube Waddell in that 1912 World Series. From 1908 to 1923, he played with Boston and Cleveland. His only roommate while he was a Major League Baseball player was Tris Speaker. In 1913, he actually slipped in spring training and landed on his thumb. And because of this injury, he changed his delivery. And that's when his shoulder pain started. From 1913 to 1915, his arm was in so much pain that he decided to retire in 1916. But after a year out of baseball, well, almost 3 years out of baseball because of the arm pain and just him not playing, in February 1917, he spoke to Tris Speaker and had the Red Sox sell him to Cleveland for $15,000. And he played the last 5 years of his career from 1918 to 1923 as just an outfielder and didn't pitch again, but was a tremendous outfielder as well. And then in 1923, he did not like the fact that they didn't want to pay him as much as he wanted, so he actually quit baseball and became the coach of Yale. And he was their coach from 1923 to 1942, primarily because he was just tired, I think, of some of the rigors of baseball, and they matched his Cleveland salary. The next player I want to kind of identify is another player that I collect, Paul Waner. Paul Waner was from Hera, Oklahoma. He had over 3,100 hits in his career. He's still, I believe, top 20 all-time in hits. He was only 5'8" and 150 pounds. His dad also wanted him to be a lawyer and go to Harvard. But there were a scout team when he was 16 wanted to see a player from the San Francisco Pacific Coast League, came to Oklahoma to look at a player, and the player didn't play. He didn't think he was very good, so the train conductor actually told the scout about Paul, and maybe the train conductor had a little bit of a inside knowledge of Paul because the train conductor became his future father-in-law. He went to San Francisco in 1923. After convincing his dad, they paid him $500 a month. They thought he was a pitcher, but they had him shagging in right field. Waner had injured his arm, and they didn't know if they were going to actually keep him. And so they did In 1923, they were just kind of screwing around in batting practice, and Wayner stepped up to bat and proceeded to hit about 8 to 10 home runs in batting practice. And they were so impressed they converted him to an outfielder. And in his first season in the Pacific Coast League, he hit 370. And then in 1924, he had 200 hits and 100 RBIs. In his third season in the Pacific Coast League, he batted .401 and had 280 hits for the season. He was then sold to Pittsburgh for $100,000. And upon being sold to Pittsburgh, when he arrived in 1926, he told them about his brother Lloyd, who was hitting .350 in the Sally League. And he convinced them to sign him as well. So Lloyd in left field, Kiki Kyler in center, and Paul was in right field. That first year that they played all together for Pittsburgh, Lloyd batted .355 with 223 hits. Paul batted .380 with 237 hits. And Pie Traynor, the third baseman, batted .340. One of the things that was said throughout his interview as well is how much he loved Honus Wagner. In 1926, he had a 6-hit game with using 6 different bats. And he lost the World Series in 1927 against New York and never went to another World Series. And he said that World Series just went by so fast, he just regretted the fact that he never got a chance to go back. And the last player I want to kind of highlight from this is Sam Crawford. Sam Crawford, 312 triples, which is first all time. Probably will never be broken in the history of baseball. He was a voracious reader. In 1899 in the Western League playing with Grand Rapids, he was a teammate of Rube Waddell. He told some great stories about Rube Waddell, about coming out of the stands to pitch a game. And when Rube finally went to the A's, he talked about how he battled him his entire career with Rube on the A's and then Crawford eventually going to the Tigers. He said when he came up in the major leagues, baseball players were viewed crudely and were not accepted in mainstream society. He talked about a lot of the rugged characters of the time and mentioned Kid Elberfeld. I talked about an incident in a St. Louis dining room where basically they were not served. About 8 to 10 ball players went in and the dining staff wouldn't serve them. So after about 20 minutes, Kid Elberfeld took plates from the table they were at and started throwing them in the air and smashing them on the floor, just so that way they could get the waitstaff's attention to take their order. He talked about back then it was just all about being tough and smart. Those were the ball players that really relished during that time. You had to be tough and smart. He talked about how he was mesmerized by small players in that time. He talked about Dummy Hoy, who had 600 stolen bases, and Wee Willie Keeler, and Tommy Leach. He talked about how they all were just smaller statured men, but tough men who played this great game. He talked about 4 pitchers primarily during his career that he said were the toughest. Jack Chesborough, who played a long time with the New York Highlanders. Ed Walsh, who played a long time, obviously, with the Chicago White Sox. Cy Young, who obviously played with Boston for the majority of his time when Sam faced him. But he said number 1 was Walter Johnson. In Walter Johnson's first game, he played the Tigers and pitched a great game, but lost 3-2 because in the 8th inning, Sam Crawford hit a home run off of him to win the game. He said that when he came into baseball, he came in 1899 and played with Cincinnati to start his career. They paid him $150 a month. And even though he played with Ty Cobb, 2 players stuck out to him more than any. He said by far the number one player he ever played against was Honus Wagner, because he played everywhere. He could play outfield, he could play third base, he could play shortstop. And Honus Wagner, even though, we see pictures of him, he talked about him having a stature and just being a big guy and how he was intimidating. And yet they got along really well, and he thought he was just the best player he played against. And he said a close second was Nap Lajoie. He talked about his graceful speed. He was a sweet man and a kind man. He said he and Wagner were the best of all time. He talked about how playing all those games, they didn't have great medical staff, so they used to use something called Go Fast. It was called a Go Fast rub down, which was basically they mixed Vaseline and hot sauce to basically create, I guess, some type of a Bengay or a hot rub to help their muscles relax and help their muscles repair in between games. And I think the thing that mostly I took away from all of this is the fact that these four men and all the men in the book just talked about a different time, a different era of baseball. And I think that's why as collectors, we gravitate to it so much. We look at that game as a simpler game and as a game that we wish we would have seen. And through these stories like The Glory of Their Times, we can see some of that, and we can relive some of that while we collect their cards and are such admirers of them. This is a fantastic book. I think everyone should read it. I think that there's a lot of things in this book that you can learn about this great game. So that's going to be it for this episode. Next week, I'm going to come back with another episode as part of my 7-part series on the road to Strongsville, and I hope you tune in at that time. Thank you.